Welcome to Renegade Inc, the talk show which allows us to think differently. Most people who work in developed nations know that there's something badly wrong in their economy. Even if they can't fully articulate it, many people feel they have to work harder and longer just to stand still. There always seems to be an economic headwind that denies fair return on the hours we put in. So what is this formless force that pushes against us? And why is it such a different story for people who work in the financial industries who, after such collective failure in 2008, are once again squeezing Main Street for every penny? Rana Foroohar's latest work, which caught our attention, is her book called Makers and Takers. So the Renegade Inc team travelled to New York to talk with her about the clear and important divide that she has carefully outlined. There are those in financialised industries whose business model means they're incentivised to take, and there are those in the real economy whose business model means they actually have to make things for a living. The makers could survive without the takers, but the takers would find it much trickier without the makers. This means these two contradictory groups don't make happy bedfellows. By clearly making this distinction, Rana has made an important contribution for anyone who intuitively feels that the financialisation of our economies has come at a massive price. I began by asking her what she sees when she looks out at the business landscape today. You've created the divide between makers and takers. When you look out at the business landscape in the US and globally, what do you see?
I see a lack of the right narrative. I think that, two things. For starters, everyone believes that what's good for business is good for consumers, workers, society at large. That's particularly true, I would say, in the kind of Anglo-American centric view of things.
And that assumption still stands?
And that assumption still stands, but the data doesn't support it at all. If you look at the last few years, particularly post-crisis, but really the last 20, 30 years, and this is a crucial thing, there's been a breakage between the fortunes of companies and the fortunes of consumers and workers. So it used to be, really up until about the mid-1980s, that they did sort of rise together. Now companies are way up here, floating 35,000 feet above national concerns. Their prosperity, markets are at record highs still, has nothing to do with what's happening on the ground level.
That disconnect has surely never been greater.
I have been shocked that since the crisis that people haven't been more up in arms. I mean, we had the Occupy movement, but given the amount of information I think that's out there right now and the statistics that support that actually what's good for business is not at all good for you, average American person or average rich world person, it's stunning that people aren't more upset.
But people are thinking that now. And that latent dissent hasn't gone anywhere just because Occupy went away.
That's true.
So how do you begin to channel that so it's constructive as opposed to this sort of violent mass of people protesting and not actually focusing their attention where it can be most effective?
Well, I think getting a larger group of voices in the room, for starters, is really important. In my book, in the author's note, I talk about the reason that I came to write this and sort of what happened. There was a bit of a come to Jesus moment.
And what was that? Can you just talk?
Yeah.
Was that an epiphany or was that a steady stream of events? Was it a moment where...
Well, I mean, I've been a business and economics journalist for 27 years, and I've witnessed any number of CEOs, well-meaning people, not trying to be bad guys, doing things that I just thought, like, why are they doing this? This is going to jack up your share price for one quarter, and then it's going to tank your whole company in 5 years. Why are you doing this? But coming back to this sort of the real come to Jesus moment, in 2013, I was sitting in an off-the-record meeting with a former Obama administration official who'd been very involved in the bailouts of the too big to fail banks. And as is always the case, the administration sort of sent out these envoys to say, we've done a great job, we're going to wipe our hands, nothing to see here, move on, tie a bow around everything. And we were talking about the Dodd-Frank financial regulation, which at that point, amazingly, was still only about halfway written. And that's 4 or 5 years on from the crisis, which was stunning in and of itself. And the official was saying, well, banks have not been able to manipulate this process. We've gotten strong regulation through. And I had just done a column noticing that 93% of all the meetings on some of the most contentious parts of regulation had been taken with bankers themselves, with the institutions and individuals who were going to be regulated. So I raised my hand and I said, well, how can you say that you've gotten a great piece of regulation through when 93% of the people talking about it were the ones that are going to be regulated? And here's the kicker. He looked at me with really honest befuddlement and said, well, who else should we have been talking to? And I remember looking around the room, which was filled with financial beat reporters, and thinking, oh my gosh, everyone's going to be scribbling. And no one was. There's so much cognitive capture. There's such a conventional wisdom here, such a narrative, that nobody even understands how bizarre that is.
It's amazing. Is it because once you're in the story, you can't get far enough away from the story to understand the context and what's really going on? Is that the case?
I think that's part of it. I mean,
or is it a courage issue?
Well, it's both. The first point I would say is absolutely true. I mean, you think about it, anything that you're really in the weeds in, you start to develop a kind of losing the forest for the trees.
So Stockholm syndrome.
That's right, it's a bit of Stockholm. And in fact, what's interesting is research shows that the more educated you are, the more tightly you hold to your prejudices.
Is that right?
That's right. There's a certain cognitive grounding where you may read more, you may be taking in more news, but once you come to your fixed idea about your worldview, you are much less likely to want to give it up. And I think that that's sort of an egotistical thing.
Right.
But the courage issue is an important one, and it's funny because I spoke to some old financiers. I spoke to a lot of old financiers actually for my book, and it's interesting, they're a whole different breed.
Why?
Well, if you think about it, the guys that are in their 80s, the Warren Buffetts, the Jack Bogles, they came of age when the financial system was entirely different. They saw themselves as being sort of stewards of people's money. They were not traders. They were guys who were going to take very, very careful care of your finances. And so they just have a different perspective, and I think that many of them told me that they felt that some of the regulators, certainly some of the people that were involved in the crisis, could have pushed back more on the banks and said, you know what, you're going to pay for this. I remember actually in particular one older guy I spoke to, I was saying, well, why when the Obama administration walked into the room and said, you know what, we want you to pay for X amount of the bailouts, and the bank said, no, we're not going to pay for any of the bailouts. How come they didn't push back? And this guy said, well, nobody was afraid of them. Nobody was afraid of them. They didn't think they were going to stand up. They were part of that team.
But what a vacuum of leadership. Because
Absolutely.
ultimately, if you're going to bail out Wall Street at the expense of Main Street, you're going to keep all these negative social indicators going in the wrong direction.
I would actually argue that one of the reasons that President Obama wasn't as successful as he might have been in obtaining any of his agenda. He got healthcare through, but there were any number of things that he was going to do, educational reform, tax reform, just a whole portfolio of things that once he lost that battle, once he sold out American homeowners for Wall Street, there was a perception issue. He lost a lot of the liberals. The liberal coalition started to split. I think that you still see that divide in the party, and actually I think that this is going to be a key thing for American Democrats going forward. Are they finally going to decide to pick up the mantle and be the party of workers? And by the way, if you define worker not just by per hour income, but who is insecure and what their power is relative to the corporation, that's a whole lot of people under that umbrella.
Move a bit further there, the value creators and value extractors. And Obama didn't ever stand up for the value creators.
No, and I'm not sure in his heart of hearts he really understood that division.
Is it that he's surrounded by a bunch of economists who can't provide him with enough clarity to say, this is the divide, these people create value, these extract it, and actually these two things are mutually exclusive?
Yeah, I think if you look at who was really in power in economic circles during his tenure, it was still the kind of Bob Rubin, Larry Summers, Wall Street financialized crowd. They may be Democrats, but they have the same worldview.
But it doesn't matter about the sticker.
That's right.
The neoliberal or the agenda is still right at the heart of it.
That's right, and that hurt Hillary Clinton as well. Because she, finished her off from that very first debate where she didn't come out clearly and say, we were wrong on certain aspects of trade. She sort of said, well, you could argue this or that about now. No.
When people are feeling it every single day.
Nothing resonates unless it really touches people's felt experience.
Right.
And this so did.
How do you begin now to start the conversation and the job of ordering business so it actually serves society as opposed to extracts value from it?
Well, as I say, I think that the important thing is getting people who are not necessarily part of the financial cabal in the room. And that's really happening at an organic level. You know, one of the most fascinating things that's happened to me since the book came out is I was asked to come and speak in front of a group of artists at Parsons. And I thought, oh my gosh, why are these artists, you know, wanting to talk to me about this hardcore economic book? Their professor had put it on the syllabus as mandatory reading, and they were fascinated because they were feeling this experience in their day-to-day life. They were particularly interested in my housing chapter, where I talk about how private equity has come in and bought up the majority of single-family housing in America. And Blackstone, a private equity firm, is actually the largest owner now, landlord of single-family real estate in America. And they were feeling it because a lot of investors go into edgy neighborhoods these days and they try and bring artists in. I mean, you've probably been courted by these people. They try and bring creatives in, give them cheap housing, run up the rents in the neighborhood. It's the Soho effect, right? And then the minute the rents are up, they kick them out. Right. And that had happened to some of these artists. And so they really wanted to understand at a deep level, why is this happening? Why are these people doing this? What's this all about? And they actually now want to create artwork about that.
The gentrification process.
Yes, and not just gentrification in those loose terms. You know, we kind of know about that concept, but why does that happen? Why does it happen? Because in 2008, we had a financial crisis that tanked property prices. We then had private equity that was not beholden to the same regulation as the banks themselves go to the administration and say, hey, we can set a floor on these markets if you let us go and buy all these properties for cash on the courthouse steps. And that's what they did while everybody else couldn't get credit. So you had finance benefiting from the very crisis that it had created.
The irony is it burns.
Oh, God, it burns, indeed.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc., the show that allows us to think differently. Before we talk more with Rana Foroohar about the consequences of a rapacious financial system, let's have a quick look at this week's Renegade Inc. Index. Let's start, as we always do, with our favourite tweets. First up from Kirsten Gillibrand. No person who works 40 hours a week should still live below the poverty line. It's time to raise the national minimum wage to $15. Second is from a guy called Bernie Sanders. How insane is this, he says, at a time of massive inequality, Trump wants to repeal the estate tax, a $353 billion tax giveaway to the top 0.2%. I wonder why he wants to do that, the estate tax. He's got a vested interest. Next up is from Democracy is for People. The Senate just voted to put a Wall Street lawyer in charge of policing Wall Street recklessness. Conflict of interest much? Question mark. Hashtag corporate Clayton. Jay Clayton is a Wall Street creature, is the claim. And finally, from QE for People, this is how quantitative easing works. There must be a better way, people. There kind of is. And if you look at the wine glass on the bottom right, you'll find not only is it full, it's not trickling down, and it's crushing the rest of the economy. Now back to New York for more with the journalist and writer Rana Foroohar. When it comes to this rent-seeking idea, people often think about housing and rent, but actually rent-seeking goes across the board. It can be executive pay, it can be political capture, so you can monopolise a market. How do you begin to stamp out the rent-seeking aspect in global business? Thinking
about the numbers in this case is important, and I'm going to give you a stunning statistic. So the financial sector in the US, and the numbers would be probably even more extreme in the UK, represents 7% of the economy, creates 4% of all jobs, but takes 25% of all corporate profits. Hold that in your brain and imagine the sort of, middle part of an hourglass, and that's where finance sits, and it can charge whatever it wants.
There's your rent-seeking formula writ large.
There you go. So one of the things that I've been doing is talking to a lot of business people who are not in finance about that and saying, do you realize your bankers are taking a quarter of all the private sector profits?
And their reaction?
Two reactions. If they are private and or sort of small businesses, makers, they tend to be stunned, outraged, say, yeah, that's why we've always self-financed, we never want to deal with that. But interestingly, corporations that are public tend to be part of that whole process, because if you think about it, CEOs get anywhere from 30 to 80% of their pay in stock options. So they play the market game. They play the let's push up our share price in these kind of fake ways, quarter by quarter. Let's buy a bunch of our shares back, and and do these sort of financial engineering things to raise the share price. Because guess what? My bonus is going to be bigger. We have a system of incentives that is pushing everybody in exactly the wrong direction. So in the States, and I think in the UK as well, we have a conversation now about should stock options be how people get most of their pay. Buybacks, they were illegal before 1982. They were market manipulation.
Charlie Munger says, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome.
Indeed.
So we shouldn't be shocked.
No, we shouldn't be shocked. Finance is a complex system. And so there's no one silver bullet. So you have to look at all these different areas. You have to look at the tax code. You have to look at housing policy. You have to look at the way financial regulation is structured. But these things can be boiled down. And I would boil it down and say, we should ask the financial sector, what are you doing? For all the numbers you can generate a number that shows what you're doing for Main Street, what you're doing to make people wealthier, and keep doing that, and then everything else you're doing, let's make it go away.
You've interviewed a few, let's say, more enlightened CEOs, and they understand this game, the one that you've just depicted.
Yeah.
They must see the total futility of it.
Interestingly, it's the really, really high-end financiers who tend to understand this message best, because they're the canaries in the coal mine. They look back and they are always the first to see where the markets are going, and I think that they see, yes, we've had 40 years of this fake financialized growth. We are tapped out. They know it's going to hit their portfolios, and they're trying to understand how we can get back to more of a, creating, making at the ground level.
What's the unifying factor of the people who understand that it's ultimately doomed, and actually want to do something different?
I think in a way they're people that are sort of humble, and you wouldn't think that would be the true of, a billionaire. But I find it's not the mid-level guys at Goldman Sachs that get this. It's the sort of George Soroses of the world. I mean, he had he's a bit of a philosopher himself, because I think people that are very savvy see that the markets have their own dynamics and that they don't reflect reality always. People like Richard Bookstaber, actually, who used to be the risk manager of Bridgewater and then went on and tried to reform financial regulation at Treasury. He got kind of shut down. He's come out with a new book saying, you know what, we need to throw all of economics out the window, because it simply does not account for the messy truth of human life.
We're all rational, Rana.
We're okay, right? We're all rational. Like the fact
all rational,
that
profit maximizing,
right,
units.
And it's funny because behavioral economics, which is supposedly we've graduated from irrational, really says the same thing. It just says we're still rational. It's just rationality looks a little different than you thought it would. So it's
wow. I love the way they keep spinning this.
Yeah. No, but I mean that goes to this point that I was saying earlier about how when really smart people get very entrenched in ideas, it's very hard for them to let that go.
So these people are humble, they're widely read, they understand that it's doomed. How do they start to enact some kind of leadership when there's so much groupthink on the other side of the table?
Well, some of them are actually putting their money where their mouth is, I would say. Some of the biggest portfolio managers are actually going out and thinking about how can we deploy our large pools of cash in ways that would actually help Main Street and sort of shift this dynamic. That's a very early stage conversation. I know some people are thinking about sovereign wealth funds, like Norway, for example, has a huge sovereign wealth fund. Could that be deployed as, a motivator to push things in the right direction? But really, I think narrative is more important, because the financial system is what we allow it to be, right? We get to make the rules still as a society. If you think about what our financial system is today, it's not anything remotely what Adam Smith would have considered healthy. It's not transparent. It's incredibly opaque. Various participants in the market do not have equal access to information. They don't have equal ability to maneuver. Adam Smith would have said we have to have a shared moral framework. I mean, throw that out the window, So we've come a long way from where we're supposed to be if a market in traditional economics is to function well.
If Adam Smith came back and saw the rentier aspect of this market, I mean, imagine what he'd say now.
Yeah. Well, I don't think he would even recognize global capitalism, because, of course, in his day, things were much more local. It was local ecosystems. Merchants, customers, and buyers and sellers had much closer relationships. And interestingly, we may be going back to some of that.
Let's talk about that. Is globalization in retreat? Yes. let's say? And if it is, does that pose a bigger opportunity for more local initiatives and business to be at least associated with the society that it operates in?
I think it does. If you look at the stats, globalization is in retreat. I mean, the movement of goods and services, trade of goods and services has been flat globally for the last several years. Digital, interestingly, is way up. And that's a possible opportunity because small businesses tend to be more able to get into the digital economy. So you have small, film companies like yours that are able to come and film something here and then sell it globally. So that's a good thing. I think that right now, globalization is at a sort of a flattening point, but we don't know what's going to come next. What lives between the 1930s and 2008? And I think that countries and politicians and policymakers everywhere are trying to figure that out. I see examples of success at the city level and some at the regional level. I don't see a kind of a national model yet because I think people are trying to figure out how can we have an economic nationalism that doesn't become xenophobic, racist. It's very, very hard to say we're going to take care of our own country first, but that's not going to turn into a keep X, Y, Z populations out. And
protectionism and all
that spirals out of control. It's very, very difficult. I do think, though, that it's legitimate to have a conversation about how local communities can support themselves. Just in terms of how we get back on track, one thing that makes me very optimistic, I spend a lot of time not on the coast, but going into Middle America, interviewing factory workers, interviewing real people. And I had a fascinating interview about a year ago. I went to Caterpillar, which is a company that makes big sort of factory equipment. Diggers, exactly. I had a conversation with a line worker there. And this guy knew more about the details of globalization and how it worked and how his job fit into this very complicated global system than any number of policy wonks I've talked to in Washington. And I thought, that's really interesting because I think in the media, particularly in the US, we don't give Middle Americans enough credit for kind of knowing which side the bread is buttered on. And I think, frankly, that's why we had the really polarized politics that we did. Trump, Sanders, they knew the traditional laissez-faire political message was not what they were feeling on the ground and experiencing. And I think that is an important thing.
Hugely. And one of the most derogatory terms that I've really ever heard the media use is low information people.
Yeah.
And it's so
deplorables. That was a
basket of deplorables. I think that media like this speaks to people and meets people where they're at. Mm-hmm. And once you understand that they're fundamentally intelligent and that we stop dumbing stuff down, that actually when you put something which might be a little bit above somebody at that time, you can, as sure as night meets day, they'll go on the internet, they'll research it, and they'll work it out for themselves.
Absolutely.
Why? Because their livelihood and their future depends on it.
Absolutely.
Why aren't we speaking to people like adults?
Speaking from a U.S. perspective, I think that there's a huge bias. I think that, not to sound too Bernie Sanders, but East Coast, or Donald Trump for that matter, but East Coast and West Coast sort of liberal elite really do have this idea that people in red states don't read or something. And I mean, I grew up in rural Indiana, right? I was the child of a Turkish Muslim immigrant who started a manufacturing company.
Fantastic.
My grandmother was a British war bride. My grandfather was a Swedish orphan. I mean, I'm kind of this like good American mutt. But I grew up in a cornfield, and believe me, people were reading.
As we conclude, you mentioned in the book Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah.
She says we've never really had a meaningful conversation about really what business should be doing. And how we talk about finance and what the social impact of it should be.
I think that's right.
Why haven't we had that conversation when it's vital to everybody's life?
I think that average people have been kept out of that conversation by tribalistic language, by...
It's a guild.
Absolutely. Wall Street is a guild,
it's
for
Latin. Sure. It's doctors speaking Latin
That's right.
to patients who have no clue what they're on about.
Oh, absolutely. But I think that is starting to happen. I think the fact that you've got artists thinking about this. If you go see the Whitney Biennial that's on right now here in New York, it's incredible. There are artists making pieces about debt, deconstructing the debt held by J.P. Morgan and how that relates to their own credit card debt and
Fantastic.
it's just that's where the success is, I think.
Is that, do you think, where the change is going to come from?
From average people, absolutely.
Because ultimately when we talk about the economy, when we talk about Wall Street, when we talk about finance, the bit that's missing is the fact that it's a design job.
Yeah.
And we've charged the wrong people with the wrong brief.
Absolutely.
We've said to the economists, the bankers and the politicians, can you please sort this out?
Yeah.
And this is one of the perils of building a society on credit. There's a somebody else is looking after it mentality.
Right.
And that escapism, which comes through consumption, means that you think somebody else is looking after it. Actually, it's the designers, the artists, the innovators, the architects, and the people who can think creatively. They should be putting the brief together and then charging the bankers, the politicians, and the economists, hopefully not the neoclassical economists, just a caveat, and saying to them, that's the society that we need to deliver.
Absolutely, credit is a huge palliative. I mean, just Rajan, said this, let them eat credit. It's absolutely what we do to sort of keep middle-class voters happy. But I think that we're tapped out. And the good news and the bad news is that I think we're at a point where when the next financial crisis comes, we will not have as much firepower to throw at it. The central bankers of the world have dumped $30 trillion into the global economy in the last 8 years, and we've got 2% growth and change. I mean, it's pathetic. It's pathetic. It's the
biggest failure. Economic historians will look back at this and say, wow, those guys really had no clue.
Yeah, so we're kind of at a change point. Yeah. And, in crisis, there is opportunity.
Optimistic?
I'm more optimistic than I was 8 years ago, yeah. It was interesting, the Senate Banking Committee, they had a call for papers that would link the financial system and real economic growth, which is the first time that's ever happened.
Radical.
That they radical. That politicians are like, you know what? Show us that what Wall Street's doing is actually going to create some growth. That's kind of a big step. That hasn't happened before. So that's a small step, but it's important.
Maybe you need this, as Schumpeter would say, creative destruction to be able to get to the next narrative. Maybe we need this.
Well, I think so. And there were a lot of people in 2008 that said that's why they said let the banks go under. Let this be a moment, come to Jesus moment where we realize that these institutions can't be allowed to function as they did. Now I think it's very hard to say you should also have X number of people lose their livelihoods and become depressed and all the things that come out of depression for that. But hopefully now, 8 years on, after all we've thrown at this problem, people are beginning to see, you know what, something's weird here. Wall Street and Main Street, not actually connected.
Rana, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.